An unnatural heat crisps the edges of the world's oldest leaves. Yavana, the ancient guardian of all forests, feels this blight upon her eldest oak, like a fever in her own blood. She knows this is no ordinary drought, but the first breath of a creeping fire that could consume everything. Faced with an impossible choice, she resolves to break an age-old balance, to awaken the slumbering consciousness within the trees themselves. This single decision sets her on a path of immense sacrifice, a story where the fate of the world hangs on the wisdom of bark and leaf. By the end of this tale, you will understand the profound cost of saving a world and the unexpected power found in silent, rooted things. Where are you listening from right now, and what is the local time where you are? I always find it so grounding to picture the different places this story is being heard. What would you be willing to sacrifice to protect the very ground beneath your feet? Her palm met the ancient bark, a silent plea against the creeping warmth. Yavana poured her own essence into the great oak, a river of green light flowing from her fingertips into the deep, ringed heart of the tree. The ground trembled as the oak shuddered, its roots shifting in the soil like a giant stretching in its sleep. A low groan echoed through the quiet grove, the sound of wood and spirit awakening from an eon of slumber. Then came the whisper, not through the air, but through the very substance of the forest. Every leaf on the oak began to rustle in a complex, deliberate rhythm, a language of rustles and clicks that spoke of deep time and slow, deliberate thought. It was not a voice of panic, but of immense, patient understanding. The trees were aware. They felt the coming fire in the thirst of their roots and the dryness of the air. They began to speak of a plan, a great and terrible work that would require the will of every forest, from the deepest jungle to the highest pine. But as the words formed in the rustling canopy, Yavana's own light dimmed. She swayed on her feet, her vibrant form growing pale and translucent. The magic was not a mere spell, but a transfer of life itself, and the cost was written in the new lines of weariness on her face. She had given a part of her spirit to wake the first sentinel. As she stepped back, the entire grove watched her. The birches turned their slender trunks, the willows bent their branches, and 1,000 leaves oriented toward her like eyes opening all at once. The secret was awake, a consciousness now shared among the rooted ones, and in the distance, the wind shifted, carrying not just the scent of pine, but the faint, acrid promise of smoke. The whisper of the great oak did not fade, but instead traveled. It flowed not on the air, but beneath the soil, a current of urgent thought, pulsing through a hidden network of root and pale, thread-like mycelium. From the deepest jungle to the highest pine, the consciousness of the forest convened in a council without sound. The oldest trees, the redwoods and the baobabs, understood the grim arithmetic of survival. Their slow, deliberate thoughts spoke of drawing the world's deepest waters upward, of pulling every hidden reserve of moisture from the dark aquifers far below the stone. It was a desperate act, a plan to drench the canopy and starve the coming fire of its fuel. But this salvation for the sky meant a swift thirst for the earth. The land would parch, the streams would run dry, and every living thing that could not move would suffer. A tremor of dissent ran through the network. The younger trees, the saplings and the quick-growing birches, sent back pulses of fear and refusal. Their thoughts were not of millennia, but of the sun on their leaves this very season. Why must they wither so that others might not burn? This was the first crack in the forest's unity, a silent argument between the patience of ancient wood and the fierce will of new life. Yavana, her own strength still ebbing, felt this conflict as a sharp pain. She moved between them, a weary mediator. She laid a hand on a young birch, its bark still smooth, and showed it a vision not of its own death, but of the world after a total fire, a blackened plain where no seed could ever sprout again. Then she turned to the great oak, and without words, pleaded for its vast wisdom to find a way, any way, to spare the youngest. The forest held its breath, a world of living wood, poised between two kinds of death. The decision was made, but the cost was now a fresh and aching wound in the heart of the grove. A deep, resonant hum began to rise from the world's forests. It was the sound of roots drinking, a colossal, coordinated effort as the trees pulled the deep earth's water upward. Trunks became living conduits, and leaves began to weep a fine, constant mist into the air. A great canopy of humidity began to form, a shimmering shield against the encroaching heat. For a moment, it seemed like a miracle was unfolding high above. But below, the ground paid the price. The soil, robbed of its moisture, cracked open in wide, desperate gasps. Streams that had chattered for centuries fell silent, their beds baking into hard clay. The very floor of the forest, once a soft carpet of moss and decay, grew brittle and began to wither. Creatures who had known this place as a sanctuary now found it a prison. Badgers abandoned their sets, their paws scorched by the hot, barren earth. Deer, their eyes wide with confusion, fled in search of a single drop of water. Yavana walked among them, her steps slow and heavy. She saw a mother fox nudge her listless kits, their thirst too great even for whimpers. Each small tragedy was a fresh cut upon her spirit. She had commanded this great work to save the world from fire, yet here she was, witnessing the slow, agonizing death of the world from thirst. The salvation of the Canopy was built upon the desolation of the earth. Her heart ached with the terrible weight of this choice, a stark reminder that every act of creation can also be an act of destruction. Then came the wind, a searing breath from the wasteland. It carried no comfort, only the taste of ash and a dry heat that promised oblivion. In response, the forest drew itself upward. The trees tightened their canopy, a living fortress of interlocked branches, and from a billion leaves they released their stored life, a final exhalation of mist that rose to meet the scorching air. A great shield of humidity shimmered between the wood and the world, a last, desperate barrier woven from sacrifice. But this defiance did not go unnoticed. At the forest's edge, where the cracked earth met the first line of oaks, the air itself began to ripple with a malevolent curiosity. Figures of shimmering heat and cinder emerged from the distortion, the elemental sentinels of the great fire. They had no solid form, only a terrifying, sentient hunger. One stretched a limb of pure, wavering heat toward the wall of mist. Where it touched, the moisture hissed into steam, and the leaves there curled black and brittle in an instant. It was not an all-out assault, but a careful, cruel probe, a test. The forest shuddered as one, a wave of pain echoing through the root network. The sentinels had found the perimeter, and they had found it strong, but not invincible. They now knew the shield could be burned away, piece by piece. The first move in a silent, terrible war had been made. The crackle of fire was a new and terrible sound in the grove. From the shimmering heat, small, skittering forms of pure flame emerged, no larger than hares, but moving with a vicious, hungry intelligence. These were the fire imps, the vanguard of the great blaze. They raced across the desiccated underbrush, and where their burning feet touched the brittle ferns and dry moss, flames erupted in sharp, greedy tongues. The trees had saved the canopy, but the forest floor, sacrificed to thirst, was now the perfect kindling. Panic, a sharp and alien emotion, pulsed through the root network. Yavana felt it as a searing jolt. There was no time for a grand council. Her eyes met the ancient, drooping branches of the eldest willows, trees whose roots drank from waters so deep, even the great thirst had not found them. A silent, urgent understanding passed between them. Yavana raised her hands, now barely more than pale green light, and the willows bent their long branches down to the earth, their leaves trembling not with fear, but with focused power. They pulled not from the soil, but from the very moisture in the air around them, gathering every particle of humidity into a single, dense cloud directly above the advancing imps. The air grew heavy and still. Then, with a sound like a great sigh, the cloud broke. A torrential rain fell, but only in that one precise location, a miniature storm that drowned the shrieking imps and quenched their newborn flames in a hiss of steam. The immediate threat was gone, leaving behind a circle of blackened, wet earth and a profound, ringing silence. It was a victory, a proof that their combined will could fight the fire. But as the steam cleared, Yavana knew the truth. They had revealed their hand. The small, localized downpour was a beacon, a declaration of defiance that the Sentinels of the Great Fire would not ignore. They had won a moment, but they had also ensured the next attack would be an army. The silence after the rain was heavy with the cost of their victory. The great work of the canopy continued, a constant, draining effort that pulled the last moisture from the deepest roots. For the ancient trees, this was a profound strain, but for the younger ones, it was a final, desperate tax. A young maple, its leaves once a vibrant tapestry of green, began to falter. Its connection to the network grew faint, a whisper of confusion and fading light. It had given everything to the shared defense, and now its own small reservoir of life was empty. With a soft, splintering sigh, it broke at its base and fell to the cracked earth. Its consciousness vanished from the root network, not with a shout, but with a quiet, final pop of silence. That silence was the loudest sound the forest had ever known, a wave of pure sorrow that pulsed through every root and branch. Yavana was at its side in an instant. She knelt, gathering the slender, lifeless trunk into her arms. Her own form, already faint, seemed to bleed color into the fallen wood, a useless attempt to reverse the irreversible. As she cradled the sapling, her grief did not soften into despair. Instead, it crystallized. Her resolve hardened into something as unyielding as stone. She looked from the fallen maple to the ranks of other young trees, their leaves trembling with exhaustion and fear. She understood the brutal arithmetic of this war now. Every defense, every counterattack would be paid for with a life. She could not command this sacrifice from the most vulnerable. A new, terrible determination settled in her heart. She would find another way, a path that did not demand the blood of the youngest, or she would burn with them. She left the fallen maple, cradled in the roots of its elders, a small, stark monument to a failing strategy. Yavana turned her back on the grove and walked into the barren hills, her steps leaving no imprint on the scorched earth. Her destination was a place the trees could not follow, the heart of the mountain where the King of Stone held his court. The air grew cold and thin as she climbed, a stark relief from the furnace heat of the forest, but the silence here was just as profound. She found him seated on a throne of raw granite, his form a shifting sculpture of bedrock and quartz, his eyes like chips of flint. He did not speak, but the grinding shift of stone beneath his feet formed a single rumbling question. Why have you come, leaf woman? Your war is not mine. Yavana stood before him, her form a pale, fading green against his immense, immovable gravity. The fire consumes my forests, she said, her voice the rustle of a dying branch. But when the trees are ash, what will shield your stone peaks from its hunger? The wind will carry embers to your highest passes. The rivers of flame will lick at your granite bones until they crack. Your eternal silence will be broken by the roar of your own mountains melting. The Mountain King was silent for a long time, the only sound the slow, patient tick of cooling rock. Let the fire come, he rumbled at last. Stone endures. It is the trees that are fleeting. My kingdom runs deep, deeper than any root. We will outlast this fever as we have outlasted all others. It was the answer she had feared, the ancient, stubborn pride of the earth itself. There was no more time for diplomacy, only for truth. Then you should know the cost of your safety, she said, her voice sharp with a grief she could no longer contain. The forest is not merely burning, it is dying by its own will, by my command. We are pulling the very water from the deep earth, the water that also feeds the secret springs in your deepest caves, to create a shield of mist in the sky. We are sacrificing the world below to save the world above, and every day, the youngest among us, the saplings and the new growth, are withering and falling so that your stone peaks might remain untouched for a little longer. A deep crack appeared in the granite floor at her feet. The King of Stone leaned forward, his flinty eyes fixed on her. The slow, constant tremor in the mountain had stilled. He felt it then, a faint but undeniable thirst in the deepest veins of his domain, a subtle draining he had attributed to the natural heat. He had believed the forest was simply fighting a losing battle, not that it was deliberately bleeding itself dry for a strategy that included his own preservation. The immense, patient logic of the trees, their silent, collective sacrifice, was a force his stony heart could not simply dismiss. His isolation was not wisdom, but blindness. The resolve on his face, once as fixed as the mountain itself, showed its first, fine fracture. The crack in the granite floor widened into a deep, jagged line. A low rumble shook the mountain, a sound not of anger, but of decision. The King of Stone rose from his throne, and the entire chamber groaned as he shifted his immense weight. Very well, leaf woman, his voice echoed, the sound of 1,000 rock slides held in check. Your children fight for my peaks. My stone will now fight for your roots. He placed a hand upon the living rock of the mountain, and a command, silent and immense, pulsed downward through leagues of unyielding bedrock. Far below, the earth itself began to obey. Great plates of stone ground against one another, their slow, tectonic fury redirected by a single, focused will. The ground at the forest's edge, where the fire sentinels gathered, suddenly tore itself apart. A chasm opened, so deep its bottom was lost in darkness, a raw, gaping wound in the world that stretched for miles. It was a firebreak on a continental scale, a sheer wall of stone meant to halt the advance of the flame army. Elsewhere, the king sculpted the land like soft clay, raising sheer ridges to block the wind that fed the fires and carving deep, smooth channels to lure the rivers of flame away from the oldest groves and into barren, stone-lined pits. This was the power of the mountain, slow to wake but unstoppable once moved. The alliance was forged, a pact between the rooted and the rock. Yet this salvation came with its own violence. The ground would not stop trembling. Every shift of the bedrock sent shockwaves through the topsoil, rattling the very foundations of the forest. For the ancient oaks with taproots sunk deep into the earth, it was a profound disturbance. For the younger trees, their roots shallow and fragile in the parched ground, it was a catastrophe. A stand of silver birches, already weakened by thirst, swayed violently as the earth bucked beneath them. Their slender root systems, strained to breaking, could find no purchase in the shuddering, cracking soil. With a series of sharp, sickening snaps, they began to topple, one after another, their white bark smeared with dark earth as they fell. The King of Stone had thrown his strength into the battle, but his mighty gestures were as dangerous to the fragile, dying forest as the fire they sought to contain. The alliance of root and rock had only enraged the fire. It was not a mindless force of nature, but a consciousness of pure, insatiable hunger, and it felt the mountain's defiance as a personal insult. It would no longer play at the edges. From its heart in the burning wastes, it sent forth not more imps or sentinels, but a single, silent command. A wave of pure, concentrated heat began to radiate through the earth itself. It bypassed the shimmering canopy shield entirely, moving through the soil and stone like a poisonous fever. The ground, already cracked and dry, began to bake. For the trees, this was an agony beyond any flame. Their roots, the hidden, sensitive anchors of their entire being, were being cooked alive in the dirt. A collective groan, a sound of deep, subterranean torment, shuddered through the entire forest. Leaves, still held aloft in a protective canopy, began to curl and brown at their very tips, a mirror of the death happening unseen below. Yavana felt it as a searing pain in her own feet, a phantom scorching that told her their greatest vulnerability had been found. The fire was no longer attacking the forest. It was attacking its memory, its very foundation. She had to act, and there was no time to consult the Mountain King. His stone was a shield against the surface, but this enemy was now within the walls. Her mind raced through the root network, a frantic search for an answer in the shared consciousness of the wood. She found it not in a grand strategy, but in a simple, ancient truth. A single tree can be toppled by the wind, but a whole forest, with roots intertwined, can stand against a hurricane. She sent a new, urgent command, a pattern of thought as complex as a spider's web. "Do not stand alone," she whispered into their pain. "Weave yourselves together." The trees understood. Deep below the suffering earth, a great and desperate work began. Roots thick and thin began to shift and curl. taproots snaked sideways to embrace their neighbors, fine, hair-like rootlets intertwined with others, creating a dense, tangled mat. They were sharing not just water and thought, but their very physical strength. They were becoming one great, living barrier beneath the soil, a shield of interlocked wood and shared spirit. The wave of subterranean heat hit this newly woven mat and could not penetrate. It was dispersed, its concentrated fury divided among millions of rooted lives. The groaning did not cease, but it changed its tone. It was no longer a sound of pure agony, but of a shared, bearable burden. They had found a way to endure, but the cost was a new kind of vulnerability. In weaving their roots so tightly, they had bound their fates irrevocably. If one part of the mat now failed, the entire network would feel the tear. The forest held its breath beneath the ground, a vast, woven tapestry of root, and will now shielded the deep soil from the fire's feverish assault. But this victory was not without its martyrs. The oldest trees, the great oaks and iron woods whose taproots plunged like pillars into the earth's heart, had paid the highest price. To anchor the entire network, they had driven their primary roots so deep and locked them so permanently into the bedrock that they could never withdraw them. They had become eternal sentinels, a fixed bulwark of living wood, but in doing so, they had sacrificed their last chance for flight. They were now truly, irrevocably rooted. This immobility, once their greatest source of strength, had become their ultimate vulnerability. They had traded the quick death of fire for the slow, grim possibility of being besieged. The rest of the forest, though saved, was now bound to this fate. Their roots were so tightly interlaced that to pull away would be to tear the entire protective mat apart. They were all anchored now, a single, magnificent, and terribly stationary target. The fire had tested their leaves and found them shielded. It had scorched their roots and found them woven into an unbreakable chain. A frustrated, silent roar echoed through the elemental plane. The fire, in its relentless intelligence, would now seek a new kind of fuel, something the trees could not protect with wood or will. It would seek the very air they breathed. A subtle, insidious poison began to seep through the root network. It was not the fire's heat, but something far more dangerous, a current of despair. The whispers started in the younger groves, the trees whose brief lives were measured in seasons, not centuries. Why should we wither for a world that does not know our name? One birch sent, its thought sharp with resentment. Another, a trembling aspen, echoed the sentiment. Let the fire take the mountains, let it blacken the sky. We could draw our roots back, seal ourselves in a deep sleep, and wait for the ashes to cool. Perhaps a few of us would survive. The idea of retreat, of abandoning the grand, sacrificial alliance, spread like a blight. The unified will of the forest, so hard won, began to fray at its edges. Yavana, her form now little more than a pale green shimmer against the dark soil, felt the network's resolve splintering. She did not command from the center. Instead, she dissolved. Her consciousness flowed into the very pathways of their shared anguish, traveling root by root, synapse by synapse, to where the fear was loudest. She found the defiant birch, and without words, she showed it not a vision of global fire, but of its own potential future. She let it feel the imagined sun on new leaves in a world saved, the taste of clean rain, the company of 1,000 other trees all singing because this one had stood firm. Then she did something she had never done before. She opened the core of her own being, the last dregs of her divine spirit, and let it flow into the birch's frightened heart. A sudden, vibrant warmth flooded the young tree, a courage that was not its own. The whisper of retreat from that root fell silent, replaced by a steady, resolute hum. She moved on, from aspen to maple to pine, a ghost in the machine of the forest. To each doubting heart, she gave the same gift, a piece of her own unwavering will. With every tree she steadied, her own light dimmed further. She was burning her very soul as a candle to relight their resolve. By the time the last whisper of despair was quieted, the forest stood united once more, its collective spirit a roaring fire of defiance. But Yavana, the one who had forged that unity, was now scarcely more than a memory of green, a fading echo in the wind that stirred the leaves she had saved. A new kind of shadow fell upon the world, one that did not retreat with the dawn. The fire, enraged by its failures, had drawn the very smoke of its being into the upper air, condensing it into clouds of fine, gray ash. This was no ordinary soot. It was a silent, suffocating blizzard that began to fall upon the shimmering canopy. It coated every leaf, every needle, in a thick, light-stealing blanket. The trees, who lived by turning sunlight into life, felt their very purpose being extinguished. The dimming of the light was a terror deeper than any flame. Panic threatened to surge once more through their interconnected roots, a fear of a slow, smothering death in the deepening twilight. But then, a new idea was born, not from a single ancient tree, but from the collective mind of the forest itself. It began with a single birch, its delicate leaves trembling not in fear, but in a rapid, frantic rhythm. A neighboring oak saw the motion and understood, its own broad leaves beginning to shiver in the same precise tempo. The message spread in an instant, a command of vibration that pulsed from trunk to trunk. Soon, the entire forest was humming, a low, powerful resonance that built until every leaf on every branch was shaking in perfect, desperate unison. The effect was not a rustle, but a roar of motion. The collective vibration of a billion leaves created a wind, a great, upward sweeping breath that rose from the canopy. The blanket of ash shuddered, then began to lift, peeling away from the leaves in swirling gray vortices. For a moment, the sun broke through, and the forest was filled with a beautiful, chiming music, the sound of a billion tiny bells ringing in their own defense. It was a breathtaking victory, a symphony of survival, but the music was short-lived. The effort was catastrophically costly. The trees had spent their last reserves of energy, not in growth or in drawing water, but in this single, shivering act of cleansing. As the last of the ash blew away on the manufactured wind, the chiming faded, replaced by a profound and weary silence. The leaves, now clean, hung limp and exhausted. The forest had saved its light, but in doing so, it had burned the final fuel it had left. The forest's triumphant music faded into a silence of utter exhaustion. From his granite throne, the Mountain King watched the trees falter, their leaves now clean but their spirits spent. He had witnessed their collective shiver, their breathtaking defiance against the smothering dark. He had felt the tremor of their immense effort through the stone, a vibration not of fear, but of will, and in that moment, his ancient, stony heart, which had measured time and epochs, finally understood the fierce, fleeting beauty of a single season. The resolve that had cracked when Yavana spoke now shattered completely. He would not merely reshape his domain, he would break it. His gaze fell upon the highest peak in his range, a spear of adamantine stone that had pierced the sky since the world was young. It was the pinnacle of his power, a symbol of his unyielding permanence. He laid both hands upon its base, and with a single, silent command of unimaginable force, he broke its back. The sound was not a crash, but a deep, world-rending groan, as if the planet itself had cried out. The peak exploded inward, not outward, pulverized into a fine, gray dust. A colossal plume of this stone powder shot into the heavens, a slow-moving tidal wave of grit that climbed into the upper atmosphere. It was not an attack, but a sacrifice. The fine particles acted as a shield, scattering the sun's harsh light and filtering the ash-choked air. The oppressive heat lessened by a critical degree, and the sky, for the first time in an age, began to show patches of its true, forgotten blue. The fire's intensity dimmed, its rage momentarily baffled by this sudden, celestial intervention, but the cost was absolute. The mountain stood now with a flattened, wounded crown, a permanent scar upon the skyline. The King of Stone felt his own immense power drain away with the settling dust. His form seemed smaller, his connection to the deep earth frayed and thin. He had given a part of his eternal being, a piece of his own soul, to buy the forest a single, precious breath. He was lessened forever, and in the sudden, cooler quiet, the forest looked upon the broken peak and understood the true price of their alliance. It was not a transaction of power, but a gift of shared ruin. The sudden coolness was a shock to the scorched earth. In the profound silence that followed the mountain sacrifice, a single, glimmering tear traced a path down Yavana's fading cheek. It was not a tear of water, but of pure, condensed life, the very last ember of her spirit. It fell, landing with a soft, musical chime upon a single, hardened seed nestled in the roots of the great oak. The seed, which had slept through the entire war, absorbed the tear and the collective, weary hope of the forest in a single, thirsty gasp. The ground around it softened. A pale green shoot, no thicker than a thread, pushed its way into the ashen air. It did not grow as a normal tree grows. It unfurled with a visible, pulsing rhythm, its trunk thickening and stretching upward before their very eyes. Within moments, it stood as a young sapling, its bark the color of moonlight and its leaves a shimmering, translucent silver. Each leaf glowed with a soft, inner luminescence, a light that seemed to push back the lingering ash and heat, creating a small, clean circle of peace around its base. The weary forest turned its collective attention to this new life. The sight sent a pulse of something they had almost forgotten through the root network, a feeling that was neither strategy nor defiance, but pure, unadulterated wonder. This was not a weapon or a shield. It was a promise, a living promise that the world could still create something beautiful and new, even from its own ruin. But this beacon of hope shone too brightly to remain unseen. At the edge of the desolation, the fire sensed this new, potent life, a power that threatened its dominion not by force, but by its very existence. The Sentinels of shimmering heat focused their malevolent attention on the glowing sapling, recognizing it as the one thing they could not allow to survive, the seed of a future they were determined to burn. The last of the mountain's dust was still settling when the world went white. The central fire, enraged by the glowing sapling's promise, abandoned its scattered assault and focused its entire, malevolent consciousness into a single point of annihilation. A beam of pure incandescence, hotter than the heart of a star, lanced from the burning wastes, aimed with perfect, terrible precision at the silver sapling. There was no time for a council, no time for a woven defense. There was only instinct. Yavana, a wisp of fading green, and the great oak, the first awakened, moved as one. They threw themselves into the path of the obliterating light. The impact was silent and vast. Yavana's form dissolved against the beam, not with a scream, but with a sigh, her remaining essence scattering like emerald dust into the wind. The great oak took the full, brutal force of the attack. The light did not merely scorch its bark, it sought to unmake its very soul. For a moment, the ancient tree was a column of blinding white fire. Then the beam vanished. Where the great oak had stood, a monumental, blackened silhouette remained. Its bark was seared into a glassy, charred crust, and the deep, resonant hum of its spirit, the first voice of the awakened forest, was reduced to a faint, guttering flicker, a heartbeat away from silence. A tremor of pure, existential horror shot through the root network. This was not the loss of a single tree. It was the loss of their progenitor, their elder, the anchor of their shared mind. The forest did not just witness a tragedy. It felt a part of its own consciousness being brutally erased. The core of their world had been wounded, and the shock of it left every leaf trembling in a silence more profound than any they had ever known. The forest held its breath, a world of wood and leaf suspended in a silence of shared dread. Yavana's scattered essence, like emerald dust on the wind, slowly coalesced beside the blackened form of the great oak. She was barely there, a ghost of green light and sorrow, but her focus was absolute. She laid her hands upon the seared bark, and where her fingers met the charred glass, a soft, warm glow began to pulse. This was no mere spell of mending. She was pouring the very substance of her being into the ancient tree, giving it her memories of the first rains, the taste of rich soil, the joy of 1,000 springs. She was offering her own life to rekindle the guttering flicker of his. A faint, ragged whisper stirred in the root network, the barest echo of the oak's mighty voice. It was a sign of life, but the cost was written in Yavana's fading form. With every pulse of healing light she gave, she grew more translucent, her connection to the world of bark and stone thinning to a single, fragile thread. She was becoming a memory herself, a story the trees would have to tell without her. All around them, the forest stood in a silent, fearful vigil. Not a leaf rustled. Not a branch creaked. Every tree, from the mightiest redwood to the smallest sapling, turned its attention inward, their collective spirit, a silent anchor holding their two guardians to the world. The fate of the entire wood was no longer a matter of strategy or alliances. It was now tied to the quiet, desperate struggle between a dying goddess and a wounded king, a single, fragile thread of hope in the deepening twilight. The faint pulse of the sapling's light was the only color in a world of ash and sorrow. It had been born from a tear of ultimate sacrifice, and it had just witnessed another. It felt the great oak's agony as a sharp, cold echo in its own young roots, and it felt Yavana's spirit dissolving like mist. A profound understanding bloomed within it, a clarity that bypassed the slow, patient thoughts of ancient trees. It was not meant to be merely protected, a treasure to be hoarded. It was a tool, a key, a single, simple idea formed in its glowing core and pulsed outward into the weary network. It did not ask for shelter. It asked for fuel. It asked the forest to pour their last collective dregs of strength into its luminous form, so it could burn not with fire, but with a light that could push back the final dark. A wave of stunned refusal rippled back from the ancient trees. To give their remaining energy was to risk complete dissolution. They would be entrusting their entire future, the memory of every leaf, and the hope of every seed, to this one untested child. It was the ultimate gamble, but the sapling's intent was pure, untainted by fear or pride. It offered them not a plea, but a vision, a single, brilliant flash of light expanding from its core, washing over the charred land and leaving not emptiness, but a glimmer of new green in its wake. It was a vision of an ending that was also a beginning. One by one, the ancient guardians relented. The great redwoods sent a slow, deep current of their enduring strength. The willows offered their last reserves of hidden water. The pines, the birches, the maples, every tree that still held a spark of life, opened their hearts. A river of pure, green energy began to flow through the root network, a final, collective exhalation of a world spirit, all funneling into the one being that offered a different kind of fire. The sapling's form began to change, its silver bark glowing with an intensity that hurt to behold, its leaves becoming lenses of concentrated hope. It was no longer just a promise. It was becoming a weapon of pure creation. The silver sapling could no longer contain the river of life flowing into it. Its form erupted, not in flame, but in a silent, brilliant pillar of pure green light. This beacon shot upward, a defiant spear that pierced the oppressive ceiling of ash and smoke, striking the sky itself. Where the light touched, the world changed. It did not burn, it healed. The charred, desolate earth at the forest's edge softened, and from the blackened soil, tiny blades of new grass pushed their way into the air, a shimmering carpet of impossible green. The light washed over the weary trees, and for the first time, the terrible drain of their long sacrifice was reversed. A wave of vitality pulsed through their bark, strengthening their branches and deepening the green in their exhausted leaves. The fire, a consciousness built on consumption and ending, recoiled from this pure, unyielding expression of life. Its advance faltered. The searing heat at the forest's edge diminished, its malevolent sentinels hissing and pulling back from the cleansing radiance. For the first time since the conflict began, the alliance of root and rock held a true advantage, a moment of breath and hope, bought with the last collective gift of the forest. The pillar of green light did more than heal the scorched earth. It pierced the fiery heart of the desolation, and for a single, shattering moment, it illuminated the truth. The fire was not a singular, malevolent beast. At its core, shrouded in agony, was a forgotten spirit of renewal, a being of pure change that had been twisted by eons of pain and isolation. Its purpose had once been to cleanse the old and make way for the new, a necessary, cyclical force of the world. But the world had grown fearful, pushing it away until it was left alone in the burning wastes, its song of transformation warping into a scream of pure, undirected rage. The beacon's light did not attack this core. It simply revealed it, a flicker of ancient, wounded consciousness, trapped within the inferno. This revelation washed over the forest's shared mind like a cold, clarifying rain. The conflict was not against an enemy to be destroyed, but a lost sibling to be reclaimed. They were not fighting a war of annihilation, but witnessing the agonized convulsions of a force that had forgotten how to create and could now only consume. Yavana, her spirit still woven into the fading essence of the great oak, felt this truth resonate in the deepest part of her being. Her entire strategy, the sacrifices, the woven roots, and the shattered mountain, had been built on a foundation of defense and counterattack. Now that foundation crumbled, how do you fight a part of yourself that has gone astray? You cannot simply extinguish a part of the world's own heartbeat. Her thoughts, once focused on survival, turned toward a far more perilous and heartbreaking path, the treacherous road of redemption. Could she reach through the rage and touch the memory of what this spirit was meant to be? Or would the attempt to heal it finally consume the last of the light she had left? Shielded by the sapling's cleansing light, Yavana stepped forward. Her form was barely a suggestion of green mist and memory, but she walked directly toward the raging core of the fire. The heat was a physical wall, a scream of pure rage that battered against the beacon's glow. She did not raise her hands in a gesture of power or defiance. Instead, she opened them, a gesture of vulnerability, and she began to speak. Her voice was not a command, but a whisper woven from the oldest things in the world. She did not speak of battle or boundaries. She spoke of memory. Can you remember the first rain? She murmured into the roaring inferno, the gentle touch of water on hot stone, the hiss of steam that was not pain, but relief. The scent of wet earth after a long drought, the fragrance of life waiting to be awakened. Her words painted pictures in the heart of the flame, images of cool, dark soil and the deep, quiet slumber of seeds. She reminded the fire of the world it was meant to cleanse, not destroy, the cycle of death that made way for richer, more vibrant life. The conflagration faltered. The wall of heat rippled, and the endless roar softened into a low, confused rumble. Deep within the chaos, a flicker of something other than hunger stirred. A single wispy flame blew at its heart, detached from the maelstrom, and danced hesitantly toward her. It was a memory of its original purpose, the sacred spark that once cleared the old forest floor so that sunlight could reach the waiting soil below. The fire was listening, but the effort of this containment was immense for the forest. Holding the beacon's light steady while simultaneously restraining their own instinct to flee from the dying heat required a focus that strained their intertwined roots to the breaking point. They held the line, a silent, trembling wall of will, buying their fading goddess this one final chance to speak to the heart of the storm. A low groan shuddered through the root network, the sound of a continent-sized tapestry beginning to fray. High above, the brilliant pillar of light from the silver sapling flickered, its steady radiance faltering for the first time. The trees were pouring everything they had into sustaining that beacon, the only shield protecting Yavana as she stood before the fire, but the well of their strength was running dry. The ancient redwoods, those timeless pillars that had anchored the forest since its dawn, felt the drain most keenly. One by one, the deepest, most resonant hums in the network began to quiet. A giant, its bark etched with the history of millennia, simply stopped its slow, patient thoughts. Its connection to the shared mind did not vanish with a pop, but faded like a forgotten melody, its immense consciousness receding into a final, silent slumber. Its leaves, once a canopy of deep emerald, turned a brittle, dusty brown and began to fall in a silent, mournful rain. Each fallen elder created a void in the network, a dead zone of silence that the remaining trees had to strain to bridge. The protective canopy overhead, woven from shared sacrifice, began to thin. Patches of the oppressive, ash-choked sky became visible, and the searing heat pressed inward once more. The alliance of root and rock was failing, not from a direct assault, but from simple, utter exhaustion. The forest was dying of thirst in a desert of its own making, its lifeblood spent on a single, desperate hope. All their fates now rested on the whispered words of a fading goddess and the wounded heart of a storm. If her plea failed, there would be no strength left for a final stand, only the quiet, accepting sigh of a world returning to ash. The fire spirit recoiled from its own reflection. Yavana's whispered memories of rain and soil had not soothed it, but had instead torn open an ancient, festering wound. The revelation of its lost purpose was a pain far greater than any battle. Its confusion and shame erupted outward, not as a focused attack, but as a final, desperate scream of pure heat. A shockwave of incandescent rage bloomed from its core, a last convulsive effort to vaporize the truth and the one who had spoken it. The wave of heat slammed into the sapling's protective light, and the green beacon flickered violently, its radiance dimming to a fragile, wavering glow. The forest groaned as one, their intertwined roots feeling the death blow approach. Yet Yavana did not flinch. She did not raise a hand in a final, futile shield. She stood within the storm of its anguish, her form now almost completely transparent, and simply opened her other hand. In her palm lay a single, perfect acorn, fallen from the great oak before its wounding. It was not a weapon, it was not a shield, it was a tiny, brown vessel, a repository of deep, patient time and the unwavering will to grow. She offered it to the heart of the inferno. "This is what you have forgotten," she whispered, her voice the last rustle of a single leaf. "You are not an ending. You are the clearing of a space for this. For a new beginning." The acorn sat in her palm, an impossible statement of life in the face of absolute annihilation. The explosive wave of heat hesitated. The spirit's rage, which had burned for eons, found itself confronted with something it could not comprehend, something it was, in its deepest, original nature, meant to serve. The acorn was a truth more powerful than any flame. The fire's roar choked into a strangled, guttering sigh. The violent light at its core softened, the blinding white and orange dimming to a deep, pulsing red, like a cooling ember. The spirit was not being defeated. It was, for the first time in an age, finally being understood. The simple, profound gift had reached through millennia of agony and touched the lonely spark of creation buried deep within the chaos. The war was over, not with a victory, but with a recognition. The roar of the fire did not end with an explosion, but with a great inward sigh. Confronted by the impossible truth of the acorn, the spirit's rage collapsed. Its vast, continent-spanning form, which had threatened to unmake the world, began to shrink. Rivers of flame reversed their flow, pulling back from the scorched frontiers. Plumes of smoke were drawn down from the choked sky, as if by a celestial breath. All its incalculable heat and power, all its twisted anguish, folded inward upon itself, compressing from a world-ending inferno into a single, dense point of warmth. It settled gently into the heart of the Acorn Yavana held, a tiny, pulsating ember glowing with a soft, orange light within the shell. The immediate, searing threat was gone. The air, for the first time in an age, was still and cool, but a new and profound responsibility descended upon the silent forest. The spirit was not destroyed, only contained. Its energy, vast enough to burn a world, now resided in a vessel that could be crushed underfoot. This was not a peace, but a fragile, eternal truce. The trees understood in that moment that their purpose had shifted. They were no longer warriors in a war, but now the eternal guardians of a sleeping dragon, their roots a living cage, their watchful consciousness a permanent lock on a prison that held the power of both creation and annihilation. The fate of the world now depended on the strength of a single seed and the unwavering vigilance of the rooted ones who would protect it. The first drop fell with the softness of a forgotten promise. It struck a broad oak leaf, washing a clean track through the crust of gray ash. Then another fell, and another, until the sky opened in a gentle, steady torrent. This was not the desperate, manufactured storm of the willows, nor the abrasive grit of the shattered mountain. This was the true rain, returned at last. It fell upon the cracked, thirsty earth, which drank it in with a sound like a long, grateful sigh. The trees lifted their weary branches, their leaves trembling as the water washed them clean, revealing the vibrant green hidden beneath the grime of war. For the first time in an age, the forest was not fighting, not sacrificing, but simply receiving a gift. The relief that pulsed through the root network was a feeling so profound it bordered on sorrow. The deep, subterranean ache of thirst began to ease as moisture seeped down to the deepest, most damaged roots. Streams, silent for so long, began to whisper again in their stony beds. But this healing rain could not wash away the scars. The forest that emerged from the downpour was forever altered. Empty spaces stood where the ancient redwoods had once hummed with timeless thoughts, their fallen trunks now great, moss-covered mounds, silent monuments to the cost of their survival. The canopy was thinner, allowing more light to reach the forest floor, a small mercy that felt like a tribute to the fallen. The trees did not rejoice. They remembered the specific, resonant silence of each elder that had faded from their shared mind, the young maple that had broken, the great oak that now stood as a silent, blackened sentinel. Their relief was quiet, tempered by a grief as deep as their roots. The war was over, but the memory of the fire was now a part of them, a story written in the new patterns of their growth, and the enduring, watchful stillness they would keep for all the ages to come. Three powers, once locked in a war for the world, now stood in a circle of quiet understanding. Yavana, her form little more than a shimmer of memory in the rain, extended a hand that held the glowing acorn. The Mountain King, his crown forever broken, placed a hand of stone upon the earth, and from within the seed, the fire spirit pulsed a soft, warm orange, a final, quiet acknowledgement. No grand words were spoken, for the truce was written in the scars they all bore. A new pact was forged in that moment, a Trinity of Responsibility to replace the old balance of separation. The fire spirit, its rage cooled into purpose, would no longer be an outcast. Its immense energy, now contained, would be meted out in gentle waves of warmth to coax seeds from the soil and help the new forest grow strong. It would be the nurturer in the cradle, not the destroyer on the frontier. The Mountain King, his eternal silence now shared with the forest's grief, pledged his stone as the ultimate anchor. His ridges and valleys would shelter the young groves from harsh winds, and his deep, unyielding foundations would provide the stability the trees needed to stand guard for millennia. He would be the unmovable foundation upon which this new world was built, and the forest, its roots forever intertwined, accepted the greatest burden. It would be the living guardian, the eternal warden of the ember. Its collective consciousness would be a constant, watchful presence, a net of thought and will holding the fragile prison secure. The trees would feel the spirit's dreams and moods as shifts in the soil's temperature, and they would sing to it in rustling choruses, reminding it of the life its warmth now sustained. This shared duty bound them together in a way they had never been before. The fate of the mountain was now tied to the health of the wood, and the tranquility of the forest depended on the gentle temper of the flame. They were three limbs of a single, world-sustaining entity, each powerful, each vulnerable, and each utterly reliant on the others. It was a perfect, precarious balance, a peace that would require eternal vigilance from the rooted, the stone, and the caged sun they now held in trust. The rain fell upon the great oak, tracing dark paths through the charred glass of its bark. Yavana stood before it, her hand a mere whisper of light against its wounded trunk. She could feel the deep, resonant silence within, a hum that had once anchored the world now reduced to a faint, sleeping ember. All around them, the forest was a tapestry of scars and renewal. Pale green shoots pushed bravely through the blackened soil, their new life a stark contrast to the fallen giants that lay as mossy mounds among them. Every stone was stained with ash, and every root, though now drinking deeply, remembered the searing thirst. The land was healing, but it would never forget. This was the true shape of their victory, a world saved, but forever marked by the cost of its salvation. Her role had shifted from a creator of life to the keeper of a precarious, hard-won balance. She felt the weight of it in her very being, a constant, quiet pressure. The peace was not a rest, but a different kind of work, an eternal vigilance that required her to listen to the whispers of the soil and the dreams of the caged sun within the acorn. One moment of forgotten watchfulness, one crack in their shared resolve, and the delicate truce could shatter. The memory of the fire was now the very thing that would keep the world from burning again, a lesson etched not just into bark and stone, but into the soul of the world itself. The first seed to sprout from that charred and consecrated earth was the acorn itself. Its shell, warmed from within by the sleeping spirit, split open not with a root, but with a delicate, questing tendril of flame that cooled into wood as it touched the air. The sapling that grew was unlike any other. Its bark was the color of cooled embers, smooth and strangely warm to the touch, a comfort in the cool of the evening. Its leaves, when they unfurled, were not merely green, but shimmered with a faint, internal golden light, as if each one had captured a tiny piece of the dawn sun. This was the Amberwood, a living bridge between two ancient enemies, its very cells a testament to the reconciliation that had ended the long winter. It did not grow with the frantic energy of a weed, but with a slow, deliberate purpose, as if remembering its own creation with every inch it gained. The other trees, The survivors of the Great War did not compete with it for sunlight or soil. Instead, they seemed to draw closer, their branches orienting toward its gentle warmth, their roots gently intertwining with its own in a protective, loving circle. In this way, a new grove was born, not from a plan, but from a quiet, collective instinct. This place became the heart of the renewed forest, a sanctuary of silence and memory. The guardians of the New World, from the smallest vole to the most ancient, scarred oak, would often be found here. They came not to speak, but to listen. To feel the steady, warm pulse from the Amberwood's trunk, and remember the price of the peace they now enjoyed. It was a living monument, a library of feeling where the story of the last winter was written not in words, but in the very air, a permanent, gentle reminder of the fragile, beautiful balance they were all sworn to protect. The immense cost of that final stand was written in Yavana's own fading form. She could no longer walk among the trees as a being of flesh and light. The power she had poured out to heal the great oak, to steady the fearful, and to speak to the heart of the fire, had scattered her essence like pollen on a great wind. Her tangible presence dissolved, not into nothingness, but into the very substance of the world she had saved. Her consciousness did not vanish, it simply spread, becoming as vast and as thin as the air itself. Now, when a breeze stirs the canopy of the Amberwood, that gentle rustle carries the soft cadence of her voice. When the first drops of a spring rain hit the warm soil, the rich, earthy scent that rises is her quiet exhalation. The dappled sunlight that filters through a dense thicket holds the warmth of her gaze. She is in the resilience of the newest sapling and the deep, patient silence of the oldest stone. This was her ultimate sacrifice, to become one with her creation. She is no longer a queen ruling from a throne, but a guardian woven into the fabric of existence itself. Her watchfulness is now eternal and inseparable from the balance she forged. She feels the subtle shifts in the forest's mood, the deep contentment of the mountain king, and the tranquil dreams of the fire spirit slumbering in its seed. Her love for the world is no longer a force she directs from outside, but a fundamental law of its being, as constant and as necessary as the turning of the seasons. Deep within the forest, a new kind of growth began. It was not a sprouting of leaves or a stretching of branches, but a slow, deliberate weaving of memory into wood. The story of the last winter, of Yavanna's fading and the fire's quiet slumber, did not simply become a legend. It was absorbed through the vast, silent network of intertwined roots. The tale was passed like a slow, rich sap into the heartwood of every sapling that pushed through the renewed earth. As each new tree grew, it laid down its annual rings, and within those concentric circles of time, it encoded the epic. The scent of rain after a long drought, the searing pain of root fire, the profound silence of a falling elder, the gentle warmth of the Amberwood, all of it was captured. A young birch does not remember the war as you or I would recall a story. Instead, it feels a deep, instinctual reverence when its leaves turn toward the Amberwood's light. It understands the fragility of peace in the very pattern of its grain. This living history is the forest's greatest defense, a biological library where the past is not read, but felt. The warning is in the tight, dense rings formed during years of thirst. The promise is in the wider, generous rings that grew in seasons of gentle rain. Every new generation is born already knowing the price of the world it inherits, its very body a testament to the balance it must now protect. The trees do not need to speak of the last winter. They are its living record, its permanent, unyielding witness, and so the seasons began their slow, patient turn once more. Years flowed into decades, and the scars of the great conflict softened under a blanket of moss and new growth. The forest did not merely recover, it transformed. Animals whose grandparents had fled the scorched earth now returned, their dens and burrows dug into the rich, moist soil beneath the protective canopy. Streams that had run dry now chattered over stones, their music a constant, gentle background to the rustling of leaves. The air itself was clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers, and a gentle, perpetual warmth emanated from the heart of the Amberwood grove, a comfort against the chill of night. It was a world reborn, more beautiful and intricate than before. Yet, woven into this beauty was a profound and solemn understanding. The guardians of this new world, from the tallest tree to the smallest shrew, carried a quiet knowledge in their hearts. They enjoyed the sunshine and the rain. They raised their young and stored their food, but they never forgot. The peace they lived in was not a default state of the world, but a carefully maintained achievement. The ember of the fire spirit slept within the Amberwood, its dreams a soft, warm pulse felt through the root network, a constant reminder that the power that nurtured them was the same power that had once threatened to consume everything. This knowledge did not create fear, but a deep, shared responsibility. The watchfulness of the forest became as natural as breathing. A squirrel caching nuts would pause, its ears twitching not just for predators, but to listen to the quality of the silence. A stag drinking from a stream would sense the temperature of the water, alert for any unnatural warmth. The trees themselves maintained their intertwined root mat, not out of urgency, but as a permanent, living fortress. Their collective consciousness remained a gentle, humming net, feeling for any shift in the slumbering giant they guarded. This is the true legacy of the last winter, a world that knows the precise cost of its own existence. The safety of every living thing now rests upon this eternal, peaceful vigil, a watch kept not with weapons, but with memory, and held together by a love as deep and as enduring as the roots that bind the earth. Her voice is the wind now, a quiet song that stirs the leaves of the Amberwood. Her tears are the morning dew, clinging to each blade of new grass with the weight of a memory. And her love is the deep, quiet resilience in the heart of every living thing, from the smallest seed to the most ancient, scarred stone. The trees stand as they always have, but they are no longer merely trees. They are sentinels, their roots forever intertwined not just for strength, but as a vast, living network of shared purpose and remembrance. The last winter was not simply a battle won. It was a profound lesson etched into the soul of the world. It taught that true salvation demands more than sheer power or unyielding will. It requires the quiet strength of compassion, the willingness to understand an enemy, and the courage to make a sacrifice so complete that it changes the very nature of the one who gives it. The world that exists now is forever balanced on that delicate edge, a beautiful, precarious peace held between the memory of fire and the constant promise of renewal. This balance is not guarded by walls or weapons, but by a legacy, a story written in bark and root and stone. It is the enduring legacy of the trees who, when faced with the end of all things, chose not to flee or to fight for themselves alone, but to awaken, to join together, and in doing so, taught the world how to save itself.